Welcome to Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. We are coming to you on Facebook Live in the studio here with the man himself, Shaka Ssali. This is the show where Shaka gets to answer your questions. Shaka, welcome. Thank you for joining us today on Shaka Extra Time. How are you doing today?
I am hugely terrific, Jackson. How are you?
I'm fine, I'm fine. You look good.
Thank
I like
you.
your hat again.
You too.
Brought it.
You too.
Our last.
Well.
So, Shaka, lots happening on the continent. Let's start off with sad news. Yesterday, coming out of South Africa, the death of the icon, anti-apartheid icon, an activist and mother of the nation, Winnie Mandela. She passed away yesterday. What do you see as her legacy?
Well, first of all, you know, she meant different things to different people. So there are people who dwell on what they characterize as her quote-unquote controversy. But a lot of people, from what I have seen, frankly, they are celebrating her. Because among the people that she had actually problems with were the South African bishop, Nobel Peace Laureate, a man who was in charge of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you remember that they really had some kind of exchange, Desmond Tutu.
Right.
But guess what he actually said yesterday? He was one of the first people to comment on Winnie Mandela's passing away. And he said, quote, Winnie Mandela was a defining symbol of the struggle against apartheid. She was undeniably one of the greatest icons of the struggle against white minority rule in South Africa.
Right. And
we
saw that today President Cyril Ramaphosa visited the Mandela family and described her as a voice of defiance and resistance in the face of oppression. One of the things that I remember is after the Rivonia trial, I was looking at the videos from then when she was being interviewed. This very young, fresh-faced woman who had just been married just a couple of years, and
remarkably gorgeous.
Right. The husband being sent off for life imprisonment to Robben Island. And she was the voice of defiance and hope at the time for a lot of South Africans.
Voice of reason, in fact, even, long after independence, she has been characterized as someone, frankly, that remained the voice of reason and in many ways who actually gave the voice to the voiceless of South Africa.
Right, and she stood up for the people.
She did.
Even after the end, of apartheid, Winnie Mandela still remained that figure that always spoke truth to power, regardless of who was in power, including at the time when the former husband, Nelson Mandela, was president.
It is interesting that the Nelson Mandela Foundation also has come out and it says, I quote, all South Africans are indebted to Mama Winnie, whether they acknowledge it or not. Such is the complexity of Winnie Mandela's legacy. The Mandela Foundation adds, quote, from the witness of her life, we knew we could stand tall. We knew also we could falter and stumble. Either condition was an affirmation of life.
Right, right. Given that there's so many people paying homage to her, we saw on social media in the U.S. there are many American politicians, including Jesse Jackson, Karen Bass, Maxine Waters, paying homage in their respects about this, wonderful resistance fighter who, for many, was a symbol of hope.
Yes.
But she was still a very polarizing figure, like you said in the beginning. But why do people on different sides look at her differently?
Jackson, that is normal, to be honest with you, because I recall as a young upcoming intellectual in the graduate school at UCLA, and we're talking about the 80s, my friend. I was able to take a course known as historiography. It talks about different interpretations of history. In other words, there are different perspectives of whatever you can actually look at. For example, I recall that a former U.S. president, Richard Nixon, You remember his problems with Watergate and what have you. And when being interviewed, I remember a journalist asking him, what do you think? How do you feel or think that history will treat you? And he came back and said, you know, David, basically when you talk about history, if you want history to be favorable to you, either you have to write it yourself or commission someone to do it on your behalf. And the great British Second World War Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, asked the same question, basically said, luckily, I am going to have to write it myself.
So who's going to write the history of Winnie Mandela?
The observers of Winnie Mandela. There are a lot of Africans. In fact, they have started writing part of that history.
How is history going to remember her? I guess that's the best way to rephrase that question.
I think you see some of these views now reflected in some comments coming out of South Africa. They're basically using celebration, really. You heard, of course, some of the words that came from Cyril Ramaphosa himself. In fact, there is a picture where after Mandela is immediately released from prison in 1990, there is a picture where there are three very important people. In the center is Nelson Mandela. On the right is Winnie Mandela. And guess who is on the third? It's a face of young Cyril Ramaphosa.
Bearded with full head.
That is correct. with the sideburns and what have you.
Right.
And, you know...
You're talking about the time when he had just been released from prison, and he was about to give a speech at City Hall in front of a crowd of about 200,000 people. And he realizes, he notices as he was about to start reading his speech, and we're talking about Nelson Mandela at the time, about to give one of his first speeches, actually, and he realized that he had forgotten his glasses, and guess whose glasses he used? And in a very symbolic way, he asks for the glasses of Winnie Mandela, the lady who most likely is the reason why he was released from 27 years of incarceration.
Not only is the reason probably why he was released, but probably why he became the most important face and symbol of the fight against apartheid, while in fact sitting in prison, Robben Island and Poolsmoor.
She kept the flame burning.
Precisely, because don't forget that there were other equally or even more important prisoners in Robben Island. We're talking about Walter Sisulu, for example. The father of the current South African foreign minister, the beautiful foreign minister of South Africa. This is the man who recruited, in fact, young Nelson Mandela to join the ranks of the ANC. And he spent more than 20 years, just like Mandela, in prison, and yet he didn't feature so much.
Absolutely.
But here was a very young, remarkably gorgeous, smart woman who pretty much kept this man's name really in the public.
And she's the reason people like you and many others as young activists and intellectuals at universities across the world. Tell us a little bit about your work and many others, for example, in California when you were a student.
When I was at UCLA, we had the Mandela Tent City at UCLA. And guess what?
Mandela Tent City.
Yes, and among some of those people that used to be, part of it, were the current Congresswoman, Karen Bass, from Los Angeles. Karen Bass, Maxine Waters, and all these people and what have you. I used to see these people, participating and what have you through a lot of different fora. And I recall when I was an undergraduate student at the State University of New York in Albany, I first came across a film called I think it was called The Black Grave of Dimbaza or something of that sort. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it featured Winnie Mandela. And I looked at this, incredibly gorgeous, very outspoken, remarkably eloquent, a fighter, a lady, frankly, that represented the best in people who struggle for freedom. She proved, for example, that you didn't, first of all, have to be a man. Second, that you didn't, in fact, have to carry a gun, an AK-47, in order for you to fight for your social, economic freedom. And there she was.
Absolutely.
There she was. So,
Great point.
you know, when it comes to reporters like you and I, she also reminds me of a former ABC News television anchor, the late great journalist Peter Jennings from Canada. I remember him talking about how journalists, when they are looking at a story, they basically either look at it or see it through their own different social, cultural lenses of experience. And so when we talk about Winnie Mandela, how is she going to be remembered? She's obviously going to be remembered in a manner that is a reflection of the different perspectives.
If you're just joining us, this is Shaka Extra Time. I'm with the man himself, Shaka Ssali, right here in the studio. And the first part of our program today, we're talking about the legacy of none other than the late Winnie Mandela, who passed away yesterday, the civil rights icon, anti-apartheid campaigner, who many feel that represented different things to different people, but there's consensus and agreement that she was a great woman and that the world and South Africa has lost a lot. What can she teach to young civil rights activists on the continent today?
I think that she not only inspired, by the way, during those days, a lot of other freedom fighters. People, whether they were fighting for independence in neighboring Zimbabwe, whether it is South Sudan, whether it was Angola, it was Mozambique, wherever there was a struggle, somehow the name Winnie Mandela would be mentioned, alongside, of course, the other great, liberators like her husband, Nelson Mandela. I think that, again, like I said, she taught us, and frankly, a lot of people, I have to say it again, that you didn't actually have to carry an AK-47.
Right.
And that you didn't have to be a man.
Which brings us to the next topic. We want to touch it briefly. We actually spoke a little bit about it last week. A gentleman by the name of Miguna Miguna, an opposition figure in Kenya who was deported twice now.
Twice.
At the time when we were having the conversation last week, he was somewhere in a bathroom, and it's actually, we thought when he first tweeted that he was being held in a bathroom at the Kenyatta International Airport, we thought it was a joke, but when pictures came out, he was actually in the bathroom.
Precisely.
The same night or the next day, we had that he had been forcefully put on the plane and flown to Dubai, where he spent a day, and then he's in Canada right now.
Actually, not just a day. I think he spent about 4 days in Dubai, and he alleged, for example, that he was sedated, he was injected with some kind of poison or whatever it was, which made him not being conscious until they arrived in Dubai. He didn't actually know where he was until they were actually getting out of the aircraft, and he said, where is this? Where are we? And the guy next to him, who happened to be a Kenyan security or civil or secret service personnel, said, we are in Dubai.
Unbelievable.
How did we get here? He said, well, we came with, United Emirates. Is it United Emirates?
Right. So he was in Kenya one night, and then he woke up and he was in Dubai.
In another country.
In another country.
Another continent.
Why, again, is the Kenyan government going at great length? And that's the question we actually had. We talked about this last week. Why is the Kenyan government, or Kenyatta's government, going to this great length to treat this man with this type of heavy-handedness?
It is obviously getting a lot of public relations battling, and I think that it has lost a lot in terms of the image, and yet this is a country, frankly, that benefits enormously in terms of attracting tourists. But I think that you should also look at Miguna Miguna's contribution. You remember that we said there was probably no need for the Kenyan government to behave the way it did because it succeeded actually in making a huge political mountain, just like Mount Kilimanjaro, the tallest mountain in Africa, out of a moral hill. And this is exactly where Miguna Miguna sits right now.
They basically elevated the profile of this gentleman.
That's true, but then there is also the other side. The government is saying that as far as the government is concerned, they did not actually deport Miguna Miguna. They said there was some kind of somebody who was, in their view, an undocumented alien, undocumented. Can you imagine a man who was being covered 24/7 on some of Kenya's major media platforms? We're talking about KTN. We're talking about Citizen Television. We're talking about Nation Media Group. He was featured in some of the major daily newspapers. We're talking about the Daily Nation. We're talking about the Standard and all that kind of stuff. And you actually have the audacity to say that as far as we are concerned, we didn't know that it was a Miguna Miguna who obviously is one of us and was born in Kisumu County.
Right. And so this is actually one of the questions that it was our first question from Messi Tracy from Kigali, Rwanda, who asked you, Shaka, a second deportation for self-proclaimed general of national resistance movement of Kenya, Miguna Miguna, was it justifiable? Would it have happened if he had complied?
I think that ideally, if he had complied, he would have actually been received in Kenya. But you see, the government had a political interest. The government wanted to tie his hands behind his back and his feet together so that he could not politically punch. That's the reason why, because he actually flew on a Canadian passport. International law requires that you disembark on the same specific document that you traveled. And if you did, in his particular case, he would require a visa. And so the government was actually willing to give him a 6-month visitors or tourist visa. In the meantime, they sort out his, his citizenship problems, which really are not in contention, really. So
everybody knows Miguna is a Kenyan.
So it is more political, really, than legal and all this kind of stuff. Yet he himself really wanted to enter as a Kenyan on the basis of the fact that the Kenyan courts themselves had actually ruled that he be allowed back in Kenya unconditionally. And he stood on that.
And the fact that he had been illegally deported.
Illegally deported, not to mention, by the way, that before he was deported, he actually was a candidate for the governor of Nairobi County.
I had to rush you on the second one. This is the second question coming in from Lagos, Nigeria, one Adesemoju Akimboye. The question to you, Shaka, is why did democracy, or why does democracy in Africa bring little or no development, and who is to blame?
I think part of it, first of all, I would tell my brother that I don't know what kind of democracy he is talking about. Because let's face it, democracy just seemed to be crawling in his own country, Nigeria, because the first time, frankly, most observers will agree that Nigeria actually conducted a credible, free, fair, transparent, verifiable, democratic election. Was 2015. And so I think he needs to be a bit patient to see what kind of results that is going to bring about, because democracy, like everything else, is a work in progress.
It does not happen overnight.
No, it's neither an event nor an incident. It is a process.
You keep working on it.
Precisely. But we can look at some, countries, frankly, that are experiencing reasonable doses of democracy. Look at South Africa, for example. They were able to recall a president who was in State House.
Right.
Look at Botswana.
Absolutely.
You have a man called Ian Khama. When I last interviewed him, he said that his names, in fact, were Seretse Khama, Ian Khama. Seretse Khama being his father.
His father, yes.
And the founding president
right.
of Botswana. And Botswana, frankly, seems to be working. Why is it working? Because there is democracy.
There's something interesting about Botswana and their transition to, of these different presidents who come in and leave power just 1 year before they're actually supposed to be.
Can you believe that is happening in Africa? And he's not setting any precedent, by the way.
Right.
The individual that actually did that was the second president, Saket Masire, who is now dead. And then later, the third president, Festus Mohammed, did exactly the same thing. So this is a tradition now.
Right. And this is in relation to the third question from Vrama Saindi from Monrovia in Liberia. The question to you, Shaka, is why is it that African leaders do not usually want to let go of power, even when their tenures are over?
That's very interesting. I think that the answer is very simple. You look at those people who are presidents and who figure out a way of, for example, shifting the political constitutional goalposts, who actually don't want to go, they want to remain presidential monarchs. These are people, to begin with, who were not, at the beginning, elected by anybody to get into that office. They shot their way into that office. And therefore, they do not actually feel that they are accountable to anybody other than the AK-47.
Right.
And the soldiers who are their political constituency.
So then why the charade of these elections? I mean, we just saw in Egypt recently, General Abdel El-Sisi holding an election where he was the only contestant until the last minute, obviously, where there was this opposition character who was working, it turns out, for his campaign until the last minute decided to run against El-Sisi. Why hold this charade of an election? Spend a lot of money, waste people's time if you know that you have no intention of leaving power in the first place.
Jackson, it's a facade. It's an illusion. That is not the correct word to use in terms of describing the political process, frankly, that obtains in Cairo, obtains in Kigali, for example, obtains in Uganda, that obtains in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, obtains in the Cameroon. We can go on and on and on and on. Those are selections. Those are selections, sincerely. And these individuals do not honestly feel that they have to get into the business of accountability, because they don't feel that, in fact, they owe something to anybody other than the manner and the means through which
they came into power.
Precisely.
From Bujumbura, Burundi, our fourth question comes from Nzerimu Godfrey. He says, Shaka, can you discuss this phenomenon which is becoming a trend in African politics, whereby those who have great ideas don't have power, but those who have power have no ideas on how to develop their nations? It
is very interesting because that sort of observation keeps coming up. I first actually came across it through a very prominent lawyer, intellectual, in the Republic of Kenya, called Dr. P.L.O. Lumumba.
Yes.
And he's right, because you look at some of these countries in Africa, really, you look at the people who occupy State House, they are not the best. Again, how did they get there? They did not go there through what would objectively be characterized as democratic process. They shot their way there. And once they shot their way there, because of the things that they have done during their tenure, they kill people, they make, sometimes decisions, obviously, that favor a very small, group of people. Sometimes I describe it really as they pretty much in a position where they become patriotic to to their stomachs.
Patriotic
the
to their
stomachs
stomachs.
of their family and friends, not society, not country. That's part of the problem.
You first heard it here, right here on Shaka Extra Time with the man himself, Shaka Ssali. We're coming almost to the end of our show today. Shaka, this question comes in from Morema Boaz in Essen, Germany, who is from Uganda. He asks, is there hope for reforms in the politics of the East African states, at least in the next 5 years? But just to reiterate the answer to Mr. Nzirimu's Godfrey from Bujumbura, Shaka basically said that, look at the process with which these people came into power. If, his question was why is it that those who have great ideas don't have power and those who have power have no ideas on how to develop their nations? And Shaka is, his response was basically, look at how they got in power in the first place. So Shaka, this probably is our last question again. Is there hope that there's going to be reform in the East African region in the next 5 years? Is there any hope?
It doesn't look really that very good. Let's just focus on Kenya and see whether the political golden handshake between President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga makes any difference.
I mean, that's obviously does not mean anything.
When you think about the issue of Miguna Miguna, it doesn't seem to have really done anything.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, but let's face it, there is hope, not only in East Africa, but on the continent. For example, look at the election that is going on in Sierra Leone. They're counting votes. We saw what happened in Liberia. You have, George Weah. We see what is happening in Botswana. Again, let's face it, these are times that require people like your generation to take charge. You have to step up to the plate because you have a lot of ideas, at least according to that question.
Right.
In tandem with the advantage of having social media.
Right.
And so frankly, you know what is happening in your neighborhood and beyond. So you should be able to come up with informed choices. Right. You are also talking about the changing demographics. The majority of the Africans really are very young people. They're not invested in the status quo.
Right.
They want change. And that, they will get it. But they have to demand it because nobody can grant it to you.
Nobody's going to give it to you.
Precisely.
You have to work for it.
You have to stop thinking like Shaka, who belongs to a generation that is the beneficiary of the Gutenberg factor, the printing press. No.
Shaka, we're almost coming to the end of our show today, and we have only 2 minutes, I believe. Can you preview for us what is coming up on Straight Talk Africa tomorrow?
Luckily, we are going to be talking about more of the same things because we continue with political transitions or the challenges of political transitions in Africa. And, tomorrow in particular, we'll be looking at the results from Sierra Leone. We'll be looking at the new political kid on the block in Ethiopia. The first time that the Oromo community has actually had an opportunity to be in charge of the state in that second most populous nation in Africa. We'll be, of course, also, in a way, looking at the life and legacy of the great Winnie. She was so important, so famous, so popular, that you could just say Winnie, and the rest, people will figure it out.
Thank you very much, Shaka, and thank you very much for all of you for joining us today on Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Be sure to tune in tomorrow to Straight Talk Africa with the man himself, Shaka Ssali. Shaka, thank you very much.
You're most welcome, Jackson.
Conversation again. The big question for Martin